The next part of the presentation will deal with a quick review of some key terms and concepts from the SLO. Let's begin with the foundational skill statement. The foundational skill statement refers to the statement a teacher creates to identify the text-based skill that he or she would like to focus on teaching more effectively in the upcoming year. The ISP, or Initial Skill Profile, is a rubric that the teacher creates to describe a teacher's view of what he or she thinks a student will be able to do at the beginning of the year prior to any instruction. Again, ISP is the Initial Skill Profile. The TSP, the Targeted Skill Profile. This refers to the rubric a teacher creates to describe the various levels of students after instruction has been delivered. BOE refers to the body of evidence. The BOE refers to the work or assessments a teacher collects from students to track their progress from throughout the year. Remember, the teacher must upload their evidence at each 6 weeks point so that the teacher does not feel overwhelmed at the end of the year when trying to close out their SLO. EOY rating, or end of year rating. After all evidence has been collected, the teacher gives a final rating to indicate which level of mastery the student achieved. This could range from well below typical through well above typical. The EOY rating is different from the TSP rating, or Targeted Skill Profile rating, because the EOY rating represents what the student actually achieved, versus the Targeted Skill Profile rating, which is the prediction the teacher set for the student at the beginning of the year. To calculate student growth, the teacher will compare the student's end-of-year rating to their original target, the TSP rating, and indicate whether a student met, exceeded, or did not meet the teacher's expectation set at the beginning of the year. This is the student growth calculation that will end up in the teacher's T-test summative evaluation. And finally, the SLO Success Criteria Guide. This tool is to be used as a guide to improve the quality of the SLO while crafting each aspect of the SLO process, the foundational skill, the ISP, and the TSP. The appraisers will use this tool as they review the SLO for approval, so it's important that teachers refer to this as they write their SLO. A copy of the SLO Success Criteria has been provided in your SLO handout. The last part of this presentation will focus on the SLO as a refresher. Remember, the SLO, or Student Learning Objective, is the official student growth measure for the Brownsville Independent School District. TEA requires that any T-test evaluation also include a student growth measure. So, for BISD, the SLO is part of the T-test process for each teacher's evaluation. A simplified road to success. We're going to examine the Student Learning Objective as an easy 4-step process. Because the Student Learning Objective is a teacher growth tool, we must begin with the teacher in mind. In the beginning, the teacher chooses a text-based skill that he or she would like to teach more effectively throughout the school year. Next, the teacher outlines their expectation for students and predicts and sets a target for each individual student. The next part of the process is the lengthiest section, where the teacher will collect student work throughout the year to check to see how the students are progressing towards their targets. In the end, the student's work is used to determine whether the student met the target set by the teacher. Now, we will review the same 4 steps, but this time I will layer the SLO process on top of each step. As stated before, we begin with the teacher in mind. Once the teacher picks the skill that they wish to work on throughout the year, they will begin the SLO process by creating their foundational skill statement. Once the teacher writes out their foundational skill, they will outline their expectation for students. This expectation is outlined in the rubrics for the ISP and the TSP, the initial skill profile and the targeted skill profile. The teacher will create a target for each student in Eduphoria by creating the TSP milestone rating, where they rate the student well below typical through well above typical. A crucial step in the SLO process is collecting a body of evidence to check whether or not students are progressing towards their targets throughout the year. We call this progress monitoring, and it is one of the most important steps of the SLO process. When we look in Eduphoria, we see that the SLO progress monitoring is done in the student portfolio section of Aware. It is again the screen with all the little purple dots. Finally, we calculate student growth. We calculate student growth by comparing the EOY rating to the TSP rating. Remember, the EOY rating is what the student actually achieved, and the TSP rating is what the teacher predicted the student would achieve. It is basically a reality versus prediction scenario. The last part of this training will help you learn how to fill out your student learning objectives form, while providing you with a couple of tips on best practices for the SLO process. The top of the form is pretty self-explanatory. It includes your name, the date of the SLO, your school name, your appraiser's name, and finally, the grade and subject area of the student learning objective class that you've chosen to focus on. Now, looking at step 1, what is the focus for my SLO? Section A, you will identify the focus area of the SLO. Basically, you will show what foundational skills you've chosen to write about. You will not put the whole statement, but just the skill. For example, drawing conclusions, or regrouping numbers, or sight reading, or analyzing primary documents. The next section, letter B, is where you will write your foundational skill statement. For example, you could write, students will be able to draw conclusions supported by appropriate textual evidence from grade level informational text. That would be your foundational skill statement, and it belongs in the B section of step number 1. Going on to letter C, what led to the decision to focus on this content area or subject and the SLO skill statement? If you have multiple preps, then you're going to want to outline your argument for choosing this particular class. Again, the purpose of the SLO is to focus on teacher improvement. So part of your statement could say, one skill I wanted to work on this year was to, and so forth and so on. Looking at letter D, what TEKs for the content area or subject correspond to the most important skills? You may provide an enumerated number for the TEK. Again, it is TEKs based, so you should be able to provide your appraiser with the TEK number for the TEK that your foundational skill is based on. Do you still need extra help creating an SLO foundational skill? No problem. Use this template tool to help you write your foundational skill statement. You'll find this tool as one of the handouts that your appraiser should have provided to you at the beginning of this training. This fill-in-the-blank template was created by Stell Middle School Principal Obed Leal. He created this template for his teachers to help them as they wrote their foundational skills. You'll need to go ahead and identify a foundational skill that you would like to teach. Identify a set of skills where you'll apply that foundational skill, and figure out what multiple measure you'll use to assess a skill. Now, the foundational skill becomes, students will be able to draw conclusions supported by appropriate textual evidence from grade level informational text. Here's a math example. Let's say you wanted to use regrouping numbers as your foundational skill. So you could write, students will be able to regroup numbers. Why? In order to accurately compute in 2 to 3 digit operations. Now the sentence becomes, students will be able to regroup numbers in order to accurately compute in 2 to 3 digit operations. Here is a music example. Let's say your foundational skill was performing complex rhythms. Well, You would perform complex rhythms by applying a set of counting skills. And you would use these skills, perhaps in UIL sight reading, level 6 music. The sentence then becomes, students would be able to perform complex rhythms by applying accurate counting methods in level 6 UIL sight reading music. Now that we've talked about how to create an SLO foundational skill statement, it's time to move on in the process where you'll begin to write your rubric for the beginning of the year, which is called the Initial Skill Profile. It is page 2 of the PDF form. You will construct your beginning of year rubric in this section. You will also answer 3 questions. A. Who will be included in your SLO? B. What multiple sources of evidence or student work, both current and historical, did you use to map students to the Initial Skill Profile section? And C. Match your current students to the descriptors in the Initial Skill Profile. Let's go over each section individually. As usual, let us begin at the very top. Step 2. What do I think my students will be able to do? One important tip before writing your rubric is to always rewrite your SLO skill statement so that you have that in mind when creating the beginning of the year rubric. Now, let's begin drafting our Initial Skill Profile rubric. As always, start with the typical skill level of a typical student entering your classroom for the first time. Once you are done drafting your ISP, check it against your SLO success criteria. Does it meet those 5 criteria? Does it articulate the skills to the beginning of the year? Differentiate between skill levels? Are the descriptors aligned to the skill statement? Can it be assessed in multiple ways? And finally, is it based on multiple sources of evidence and teacher experience? Now, let's worry about the bottom half of the page. Question A. Who will be included in your SLO? When choosing your class or classes, gather informal data about your students to determine which class or classes are most representative of the cross-section of students that you teach. In this section, you'll only need to be able to identify the class that you're going to track and the period associated with that class. Question B. What multiple sources of evidence or student work, both current and historical, did you use to map students to the Initial Skill Profile? This is going to ask you to go ahead and reflect as a teacher to figure out what pieces of evidence you're going to either administer or how you're going to informally collect or what type of data you're going to look at to place students on the Initial Skill Profile rubric. As for question C, you won't be able to answer letter C correctly until you create the SLO in Eduphoria, so don't worry about it at this point. Now, let's move on to page number 3. The most important page of the SLO packet, creating the targeted skill profile. You will construct your end-of-year rubric in this section. You will also answer 2 questions. What evidence did you use to establish a targeted skill level for each student? Include multiple sources. And what will you include in the body of evidence that will establish each student's skill level at the end of the interval, or at the end of the year? Describe the measures to be used and how they are aligned with the skills identified in the SLO. Remember, the TSP rubric is a profile that describes your expectations for what a group of students will look like at the end of your instructional period. As always, start with the typical student. Take into account your special ed students and take into account your AP students or GT students if you use them in your SLO sample. Before writing your rubric, please make sure you rewrite your SLO foundational skill statement so that you can remember what your SLO focus was on for the entire span of time that you were teaching your students. Start with your typical student and construct your rubric from there, going up to well above typical and then working your way down to well below typical. When you are done constructing your TSP rubric, check it against the SLO success criteria. Make sure it meets all 6 points of the criteria. For example, does it articulate skills for the end of the year? Does it differentiate between skill levels? Are the descriptors aligned to the skill statement? Can the rubric be assessed in multiple ways? Are the targets specific to the students in the teacher's class, and are they based on multiple sources of evidence? And most importantly, does it reflect high yet reasonable expectations for student growth? Now, let's look at the two questions on the bottom of the page. Question C. What evidence did you use to establish a targeted skill level for each student? Remember, your appraiser is going to ask you why you chose a specific target for each student. For example, if a student's ISP level was well below typical, but yet you said he could only reach below typical, your appraiser is going to want to know what type of data sources you use to go ahead and set that target for that specific student. Finally, letter D. What will you include in the body of evidence that will establish students' skill level at the end of the interval or the end of the year? Describe the measures to be used and how they are aligned with the skills identified in the SLO. Here, you will reflect and list all the pieces of evidence you believe you're going to gather throughout the year. Of course, this might change as you progress monitor, but this will be your starting point so that you can have a conference with your appraiser at the beginning of the year. Finally, page 4. How do I guide the students towards the goal? Be prepared to discuss the following with your appraiser. You may use the notes section to write down your ideas. You will need to discuss things like differentiation, progress monitoring, and colleague collaboration. During your beginning of year conference, your appraiser could ask you to discuss how you differentiate instruction for those students who are in the highest performing groups as well as those students who are in the lowest performing groups. Next, your appraiser could ask you what your plans are for progress monitoring and how you're going to adjust throughout the progress monitoring period. Remember, the student learning objectives is about teacher growth, so the teacher should be adjusting their instruction as they learn what's best for how to teach their students in the classroom. Finally, colleague collaboration. Because the student learning objective, again, is a teacher growth tool, your appraiser is going to want to know what you did to help yourself get better as a teacher. That includes colleague collaboration. Especially if you're a brand new teacher, teachers should be collaborating together to discuss best teaching practices for any skill that's covered in the SLO topic. Before we get to the end, let's talk about the SLO body of evidence and a couple of issues that relate to it. The SLO body of evidence must be aligned to the foundational skill statement. It must measure students' progress on the foundational skill. It includes assignments, projects, work products that directly relate to the skill statement. The SLO body of evidence does not include student work outside the scope of the foundational skill at the heart of the SLO. TEA has set the minimum of 5 for the number of pieces of evidence that must be collected per student. A minimum of 1 to 2 pieces of evidence must be submitted for each of the following data points. Note that semester courses have different number of evidences required per data point because of the semester deadline that occurred. Please refer to the SLO calendar for deadlines related to rating students and uploading pieces of evidence. Reminder, all pieces of evidence must be scanned and uploaded into Eduphoria for each student, unless we import a test directly from Eduphoria itself. Scans should be uploaded at every progress check so that closing the SLO will not become overbearing at the end of April. Just as kind of an FYI, the state does provide a student growth tracker for teachers to use whose districts do not have an online platform that stores SLO information. The state has also recently provided an individual student growth tracker for students. Please note, you may use a tracker if you wish, but all student data must be entered and housed in Eduphoria, Scribe, and Aware. The use of the state's growth tracker does not fulfill the student's portfolio requirement. All data must be tracked in Eduphoria. The last handout your appraiser provided to you for this SLO training is the SLO Teacher Rating Rubric. Just like the T-test process, the student learning objective also has a rating rubric. Remember, the SLO is part of a teacher's T-test summative rating. The SLO is used as a student growth component of the T-test process. In BISD, the SLO is considered the 17th dimension. Student growth scores are also added to the summative report, and they include the percentage of students who did not meet expectations, the percentage of students who met expectations, and the percentage of students who exceeded expectations. The state has recently released new guidance on what a teacher's expected growth target should be. According to the state, a proficient teacher should only have approximately half of their students meet or exceed their expected growth target. This means that when teachers are weighing the preponderance of evidence for the SLO final rating, the state really wants the teacher to consider whether or not the student mastered the SLO foundational skill. This is the tool that appraisers will use to give a teacher a final rating on their approach and implementation of the SLO process. Finally, the following is a list of SLO conferences between the appraiser and teacher that should be conducted throughout the year. The following items will be discussed at the beginning of the year conference. First, your appraiser will review the drafted SLO form. Then, the appraiser will want to discuss your plan to collect a body of evidence and setting rigorous growth targets for students. He or she may answer any questions you may have about the SLO calendar. And finally, your appraiser can provide guidance and tips on any aspect of the SLO that needs revision. At the middle of the school year conference, be prepared to discuss the following questions with your appraiser. How are you guiding students towards their targets? What adjustments have you made throughout the progress monitoring period? Your appraiser will also check the validity and reliability of your body of evidence that you've collected so far. And finally, you will discuss your plans for the rest of the school year. And finally, the end of school year conference. Be prepared to answer the following questions. Did students grow? And what did you learn in the process? This end of year conference can be done at the same time as your T-Test summative conference. Appraisers will review your final body of evidence and your final student growth scores. Finally, you will discuss your plan for the following school year's SLO. I would like to thank you for spending the last half hour with me discussing the student learning objective. Remember, should you need any examples or extra resources, please visit the SLO website at www.texasslo.org. That website is maintained by the Texas Education Agency, and it is the utmost authority on the Texas SLO process. If you need any further information on the SLO, feel free to ask your appraiser. If for some reason your appraiser cannot answer your question, you and your appraiser can contact me at the HR office at 956-548-8051 or sending an email at icamadio@bic.us. I wish you the best year ever, and